Peace, my people. You're tuning into I Must Be Buggin', where Black, gifted, and otherwise neurodivergent folks celebrate our special flavors. If you've ever questioned your perspective in a world built for the masses, welcome home. I'm your host, Sheldon Gay, and I appreciate you joining me on this journey as a late identified Black, gifted man. Together, we'll rewrite the script on neurodiversity by celebrating our differences, challenging the status quo, and breaking free from old narratives that label us as deficient. In each episode, we'll explore the stories, experiences, and of course the curiosities of Black gifted adults and other neurodivergent people who are underrepresented or unidentified in a world where normal can also mean harmful. So continue with me on this journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and acceptance. I Must Be Buggin' is creating safe spaces, sparking conversations, and making sure our voices are heard. Welcome to another episode of I Must Be Buggin'. This is your host, Sheldon Gay. As always, so excited that you're joining us again. Today, I have a very special guest that I'm excited to introduce you to. I think that, again, you all are going to love the alignment with the purpose of the podcast. As we've talked about from the beginning, just being able to speak to broad neurodivergent experiences, but particularly, that capital B in the I Must Be Buggin', right? That Black experience, and again, just speaking in general to our otherwise, marginalized communities, being able to speak to those topics, I think is something that we're gonna be able to dig into today from, an informed angle. So I'm excited to talk about that. Again, my name is Sheldon Gay. My pronouns are he, him. To give you a little bit of a description, today I am wearing my over-ear headphones. I am a 42-year-old Black male, like faded side, got a curly hair on the top, mustache, little tuft of a goatee, and today I am wearing a green t-shirt. And so with that, let me introduce our very special guest, Dr. Kimberly Douglass. Dr. Kimberly Douglass is a coach and consultant to neurodivergent adults. Dr. Douglass is currently developing a think tank to meet the information and other needs of, and I always am curious about how people pronounce this. I'm going to do my pronunciation, AuDHDers, people who are autistic and have ADHD. Dr. Douglass became a full-time coach after working as staff, peer-reviewed researcher, faculty, and administrator in higher education for over 17 years. She began the neurodivergence advocacy work over 13 years ago when she became the chief advocate for her son, who is neurodivergent. She has since gotten more in touch with her own neurodivergence, and Dr. Douglass is married to Dean Tate and lives in Tennessee. So please welcome Dr. Douglass to the podcast. Dr. Douglass, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, so I like to always start with kind of a basic primer for folks. Tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you're doing, and whether or not you identify as neurodivergent, which I think we kind of know the answer, but I'm curious to hear how you think about it.
Okay, I'm Dr. Kimberly Douglass, and yes, I do identify as neurodivergent. I don't have a formal diagnosis, but I do identify as AuDHD. Both autistic and ADHD, and I became more aware of my neurodivergence, or became aware in the process of getting services and supports for my son, who has been diagnosed with both ADHD and autism. And I definitely see myself in his experience. Of course, different because I am a Black woman and he is a Black boy growing up in the United States, but lots of similarities and things that I could apply to my own life. And my pronouns are she, her. Today, I am wearing a Black top and I have a little bit of makeup with some snazzy red lipstick. And I have salt and pepper colored hair, At this point, still more pepper than salt. And so I'm good with it, and we'll see where it goes from there. And I'm happy to be here. Just really excited to be here. But so most of my adult most of my adult career, I worked in academia. I was a faculty member. I've been an administrator. The area that I tenured in is information science. So I'm a systems thinker, and I'm a person who likes to put tools and resources together for people.
Mhm,
And I realized that I have a knack for working with other neurodivergent people. And what I help them do, what I assist in doing, is helping them develop ideas they have, and that may be in the form of a business or a
mm,
project that they're working on. And I work with people to help from at various stages of their projects, helping conceptualize what their projects are, think about what resources they need. Because of my administrative executive leadership experience, thinking about how to put operations together, how to do strategic planning, um, and how to put the whole picture together, or figuring out
mhm,
which part of the picture they have, which parts of their picture they need. But it takes a special kind of a special set of skills to be able to do that and work with people in their personal regulation, um, really understanding how neurodivergent people process, how they think. A lot of my clients, we work on something and they have to go away and they have to think about it and come back. And so
mhm,
there has to be grace and patience for that, but also an understanding fundamentally of how these neurodivergencies work.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important and just really interesting to think about how we help each other as neurodivergent people kind of find our lane, right? I think how a lot of things are set up for us, it's us kind of, wondering, excuse me, why there are hurdles or like how do we jump through these hoops? But I think it's really powerful when somebody can kind of understand the experience and help us kind of work through, um, like you said, making sense of how our mind works and leveraging the power that's there as opposed to trying to conform it to another way of working, if that makes sense. And so, um, yeah, excited to hear that you're doing that work, and helping people again feel seen and heard, which I think is really, really critical. Um, so yeah, so I know one of the things you and I talked about before was around, um, doing, what you describe as decolonizing neurodivergence, doing that work around decolonizing divergence. So tell me, what does that mean to you and why do you think it's important?
Okay, so decolonizing neurodivergence, I coined that in an edited work in what year is it? I think 2022, I think it was.
Mm,
And what that so let's back up for a second. So we talk
hmm
about neurodivergence, just to make sure I'm clear on my terms. What we're talking about is people whose brain and bodies and minds function in a way that is considered to be atypical and
hmm
not in a
hmm
normal range. And by decolonizing neurodivergence, I'm pushing back on that and
hmm
saying that the conversation isn't about neurodivergent, neurotypical, because we live in a colonized society that only sees us as workers.
hmm hmm hmm
Our conversation is shaped such that you're either this or you're that. When in actuality, we are a neurodiverse range of people with
hmm
a
hmm
range of needs, and we need a range of support. But our society does not want to think in range. So just like we have biodiversity in the ecosystem, we have
hmm
neurodiversity within the human experience.
hmm
But we don't
hmm
talk like that because our society is not interested in meeting the individual needs. Even though we appear to be very individualistic, we're not
hmm
interested in meeting individual needs. But if we looked across the spectrum of human beings, you would see that there's a neurodiverse group of most people can't be put into this category or that category, but we
Mm-hmm.
do it because we typically think of people as our society thinks of people as what kind of workers they're going to be. So
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
you look at diagnostic criteria, when you look at the types of supports that are out there, the supports that are in K through 12, it is about making you get back to work. That's what it's about. So
Mm-hmm.
you're this or you're that. And by decolonizing that whole notion, we get to talk about things like neurodiversity. We get to say everybody's unique in um, their I don't say neurotype, but everybody's unique in their neural expression, just as
Mm-hmm.
you have a unique fingerprint.
Mm-hmm.
And because the conversation is about what our systems need and not what we need personally, we
Mm-hmm.
don't think about those individual needs. We
Yeah.
don't get curious about what individually what people need. You either fall into this or you fall into that, and that's just it. So it stops the conversation about what people need. We just don't think that way.
Mm-hmm.
And we just think about how we can categorize things and we can move people along. So decolonizing neurodivergence is about peeling back those layers. And I say to people, if you are late diagnosed,
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, autism, or other, that is actually an opportunity to decolonize
Mm-hmm.
because that is a form of resistance to a society that says you have to be this or that.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I want to scream it from the mountaintops. Like I 100% agree. I think, as a late identified neurodivergent person, one of the things that, has become very apparent to me is exactly what you're talking about is this, one, it's how much of society has been built on, commodifying us and just saying, okay, well, again, what, you know, it takes the question of what do you want to be when you grow up, and it makes it just very, I'll say, systemized, right? It's very much so like, are you, a quote unquote blue collar or white collar worker? Like it starts to stratify us into these things that, like you said, does not respect, honor, um, or acknowledge the individual expression. And that is also why, like, as we move through this system, we feel like we bump up against it a lot. And it's like, well,
We do because it wasn't
yeah,
created for us.
right. No, exactly. Exactly. Um, and creating awareness around that. I think what the thought that's coming to my mind right now is like, I think a lot of times, and I think we're going to get to this in a question coming up, but it's like a lot of the times we have been having experiences thinking that it was ourselves, like it's made us turn these things
Of
on
course.
ourselves, right? And it's like, well, no, it's not. We are not broken, right? We're not, less than. It's the system and how it supports us and what it thinks of us and what it wants to force us to do. And so I think, like I said, this decolonizing, neurodivergence is so important and so powerful, for everyone. And I think we talked about this a little bit too on the call we were on the other day. But um, one of the things I firmly believe as well is that when we restructure things to honor these, you know, I, I don't know. I don't even want to call us edge cases, right? But when we build systems that just reflect and honor the individual, it helps everybody. It's not just like, oh, only this corner of people are going to benefit. It's like everybody's going to benefit.
Right. And so, like, you're talking about something like universal design and considering
Mm-hmm.
the range of, so thinking of it from an individual, but also a communal perspective. How
Absolutely.
can I help meet the most needs? And when you think like that and you start with that as your basis, then you actually serve a lot more people. So, and going back to what you were saying earlier, so it doesn't allow, our systems don't allow for the individual expression, but they don't allow people to have basic needs. For example, how many of us would have had very different experiences if we were, if someone attended to our sensory needs, for example?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Making sure we had compression gear that we needed to help us when we were feeling uneasy in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, tempering noise in certain spaces or
Mm-hmm.
giving us sensory input. So because we don't think in terms of needs, school is not even set up to really think that way.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it could be something as simple as somebody's gym shoes squeaking on the floor in the
Mm-hmm.
gym that is like setting somebody off, but there's no assistance for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a reaction. And so part of this conversation is what systems do. If you are to be compliant with the system, first of all, a lot of our outcomes have been planned outcomes, number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up in places where we're supposed to end up. But when you are focused on the needs of the system needs you to behave a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when you think about how you were treated throughout your education experiences growing up, it was all about behavior,
Mm-hmm.
never really about your needs. Because if school were based on your needs, it would look very different than it looks because it is about compliance, it's about socializing you a
Mm-hmm.
certain way. And even when you're getting good things and you're getting praises, that still is about your behavior so that you fit some planned outcome.
Right.
It's not about, well, wait a minute, I actually don't need to go to school today because I'm feeling burned out today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, or I don't need to be at school for 7 hours a day. That
Right.
doesn't work for me. Or I don't need to be taking homework home. We refuse, as part of my son's program at school, we refuse homework
Mm.
because it's not necessary.
Mm.
It's not necessary, and a lot of research shows that it doesn't add anything to the conversation. It doesn't add value, and they've already been at work at school for 7 hours.
Mm-hmm.
What they're teaching you is to not have boundaries with work. And
That's
so
mm-hmm.
by taking that home, it does two things. It erodes boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
It does several things, but two I mentioned here, it erodes boundaries. And number two, it creates tension between the parent and the child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that is critical in a neurodivergent child life and critical in every child's life is their relationship with their family.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that puts additional stress on that is not good for the child. Because when you talk about a neurodivergent child, you have to think of them within the system inside their home,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not just them as individuals and how they're doing and how they're behaving, but what are their needs, but also what are the needs of the people who live in the household with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really fascinating. I've not heard. I've heard of people choosing homeschooling so that they can, make those decisions for themselves. I've not heard of anybody, just like you said, refusing. Can you tell me? Because now I had other things I was curious about, but I don't want that to sit out there. Tell me about that experience. Like what what was that process like? And yeah, tell me about that process for kind of making that decision for your family.
So, as part of what they call the individualized education plan,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm an academic, I read a lot of academic articles, and I'm clear on what the research says,
Mm-hmm.
and also I got clear on what I believe and what I value,
Mm-hmm.
and anything that gets in the way of my connection with my child, because it's tough enough having a child who is neurodivergent.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that interferes with that parent child connection is a problem. It is not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about all the screaming matches that could be eliminated by
Mm-hmm.
not sending homework home,
Mm-hmm.
all the rancor that could be eliminated if you didn't send home. And so in the meeting, just one of my requests is, because I know this is a reasonable request, other people have made it, is that we do not want to have homework.
Mm-hmm.
And so they try to push back a little bit and say, well, he'll need to do his work during school. Okay, fine. He can manage himself. He
Mm-hmm.
can make that happen. But I know it only adds to the confusion of our household for him to bring home homework.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, what I also love about that is, one, there was some compromise, but there was this very clear, it wasn't just you showing up and being like, no, we don't want it. It was like there's come from a place of being informed, but also
Right,
understanding like, look, like I this is the experience that I'm trying to create, and I think
right.
a lot of folks um, are not. Some folks are not necessarily clear about what experience they want, but I think sometimes folks are scared to advocate for those experiences, and that's again, I'm so glad that you shared that because, yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the way that schools are set up, one of the things I was going to say earlier that is related to this as well is I'm on a board for a K-8 school, and I don't know, several months ago we had a conversation about we were doing a lot of work around updating the school's mission and vision. And so a lot of the work we were thinking about was, okay, in 20 years, 30 years, like how should this school be set up? What kinds of things
Mm-hmm.
should we be doing? We had this plan from before and we kind of had this model from before, but like, if we're going to be setting the vision for, 20 years, like what do we want folks to be doing then? And a lot of that involved rethinking, you know, accommodations in the school and, what we wanted the community to look like and what does the future of progressive learning look like, right? And so a lot of these questions are related to exactly what you're talking about because if we just kind of do exactly what's been done for, however many years, we're going to get the same results and frankly, I think worse because we as humans are changing and that means that, society's changing. If we continue to use a model that doesn't fit how we're progressing, then the results are just going to get, worse and worse. So,
No,
um,
I think you have to ask yourself. I think you really have to, and this is decolonizing.
mhm,
You really have to ask yourself, what do you want from this?
mhm,
Are you growing human beings or are you growing workers?
mhm, mhm, mhm,
Because if at the end of the day, in the back of your mind, you still are really thinking workers,
mhm,
it is going to shape, and I don't care how you get there and how many, you know, off ramps you take and exit ramps and back on and meander
mhm,
and circuitous routes, you're still going to get to the same place where you treat people like labor.
mhm,
It all depends on what you value. If you value growing workers, that is going to show up over and over again. It cannot help but show up. So what you'll have is a lot of new age schools that say that they're doing something different. And good luck, and I'm not assuming this is the case with yours, but there are a lot of schools out there that say that they're doing something different,
mhm,
but what they're actually doing is preserving the status quo and
mhm,
existing power relationships. And so um, by being heavy-handed about grades,
mhm,
not allowing a lot of flexibility. There was something else I was going to say, and it kind of left me. Um, but in these spaces, you get to see how resistant, how adamant we are that we're going to continue to uphold
mhm,
these values. Because if it is to just come into these spaces, again, just referring to all other, all schools in general,
mhm,
if the point is to come into these new spaces and position some kids above others, position certain families above others,
mhm,
then we really are doing the same thing. We've just recycled it and put it in a different environment. So, are we thinking about how long they actually need to be at school?
mhm,
Are we thinking about whether or not they have sensory rooms?
mhm,
Are we thinking about whether we give grades as opposed to doing narratives for students?
mm,
Are we
mhm,
really thinking about different? Are we supporting if the family has an autistic child? Are we providing support for the family because the child does not exist? The child exists within a context.
mhm.
If we're not talking about those things, we're just doing more of the same
Right.
and we're calling it something different. We're putting a different kind of frosting on the same cake.
Yeah, I love this. For those who listen enough, they know that I'm a super huge Bell Hooks fan, and when what came to mind as you were talking about this is Bell Hooks was someone who, for her, feminism wasn't just about, you know, whatever, like putting women as equals to men, right? It was about like domination period is wrong, right?
Hmm.
Like, you know, black people shouldn't just become the new dominators, right? It's like
Right.
all this
Right.
domination is wrong. So we have to completely deconstruct all of this stuff. And if we just simply, you know, change the color, right? If we simply just change whose name is on there, we've not really done the work. And so, again, that's I really really love that focus and what you're describing. Um, so, not to completely shift gears, but um, you know, I do want to talk a little bit about the work that you do. So, tell me a little bit about what typically, and I guess it's still, it's still very much related, but like, tell me what typically compels someone to reach out to you for coaching or consulting. Like, what typically brings someone through your door?
So I work with a lot of creatives,
Mm-hmm.
and I typically work with people who have big ideas, who are pattern readers. Usually it takes them anywhere from 6 months to about 2 years to reach out to me. I have somebody I'm working with now. It took them 3 years to reach out to me because they needed to kind of sit in the cut and see what was happening
Mm-hmm.
and see if my message changed and see if I was the real deal
Mm-hmm.
and see if I was really a person that understood neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
Like, did my message change? Did my language change? And they saw that it didn't. Like, I've been pretty consistent. Typically, the person is more than likely, no, I think it entirely, they have some sort of transformational work they want to
Mm-hmm.
do, where they're trying to liberate something or they're trying to transform something in society. So I've had one person who's trying to start who is starting an artist cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
I had a person who is in instructional design, cannabis education, a person who was starting a tech company for doulas to support doulas,
Mm-hmm.
supporting people who are spiritualists. So I attract people who have these big visions and may not know how to implement or know what resources they need to implement. And so what I do is help grab the big ideas and bring them down to a size that they can actually implement them and make things happen with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, again, really helpful for folks because, you know, neurodivergent people, by definition, our minds are going to think differently about stuff. And I'd say one of the things I've run into too is like, or is I've started to realize that a lot of the tools that are out there for helping to make sense of the world assume things that don't necessarily, fit
Right.
our
They
work.
don't apply to
Right.
us.
Um, and so that can be really frustrating, right? Because you're like, wait, I know these great ideas. I can kind of see these different things, the patterns and all that, but how do I synthesize that, in a way that is uh, actionable, right? I think that is super, super powerful for you to be helping folks is to, like you said, bring everything together because um, even to being able to communicate with someone about that, like that's a huge, huge thing because sometimes our ideas, and again, the nature of the podcast title is, you know, you can feel like you're bugging, right? You can feel like what you're saying is not making any sense. And then you get to talking to somebody that can grab all the pieces out of the air and keep that thread. And then it's like, oh, no, this makes perfect sense. I can see exactly how you got there. And then you're like,
Right.
oh,
Right.
so yeah, yeah, yeah. Really,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So, and the people I work with, we don't have an issue. I think, as you're pointing out, with coming up with ideas is sometimes it's having too many
Mm-hmm,
ideas.
mm-hmm,
And so I tell people all the time, I don't do tips and hacks. Like,
mm-hmm,
I can give you lots of information about a lot of stuff and give you this tip and that tip, but that's not what makes my work valuable.
mm-hmm.
What makes my work valuable is providing people a framework to think about what belongs here in this idea and what does not
Yeah,
belong here.
yeah.
Because that's the thing, like, they don't have a framework. They haven't they don't have a scope for what they're trying to do.
hmm
So they're trying to do a lot of different
Yeah.
things. And so we have to find a way to bring that in so that we can isolate exactly what you're trying to do, and so that the people who really need to hear you can actually hear you.
Yeah. That I I hope everybody listened to that last part, because to me that just was super resonant about, like you said, making sure that the people, those that you want to hear you can actually hear you, because that, I was having a conversation this morning with somebody just about, in a broader sense, about the human need to feel heard and understood. And when we're talking about our big ideas, which we tend to identify with, right? Like those are our quote unquote babies, right? Those are a part of like who we are in this world. Feeling like you can't be seen or heard is such a challenging experience. So again, you're doing really, really important work, in the broader sense, and then, like I said, in just the literal sense around providing frameworks and stuff like that. Um,
So one issue that my clients
mhm,
have, it's because many of us have been marginalized in a lot of different
mhm,
ways. So we've been left out of things, or we've been ignored, or our needs haven't been addressed. I think it's like if people are trying to start a business or they're trying to start an organization, one of the things that they need a lot of assistance with, a lot of support with, is knowing that they don't have to include everybody.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
So because they don't want to exclude anybody, they don't want to leave anybody
mhm.
out. But when you're trying to run an organization, when you're trying to run a business, you don't serve everybody.
Right.
You have to identify the population that you're working
Yeah.
with.
Yeah. That's super important. Again, when you've got all the ideas, and I think, again, when you talked about the marginalization, like you don't want to feel like you're marginalizing anybody, and so you're trying to, like I said,
Right.
include everybody.
That's
And
right.
so,
Right.
but there's a difference between marginalizing and just having a target, I guess, is sort of the way of speaking about
You're right. Right. And understanding the scope of
it.
the
Yep.
work that you're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so kind of tangentially, kind of moving forward from there, you know, let's talk a little bit about what are some of the unique challenges that Black people and other melanated and marginalized communities face when it comes to diagnosis and getting support. I mean, I know um, that can really be a challenge. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's as you mentioned before we started, a lot of the diagnostic criteria is still based upon research done on white boys.
Mm-hmm.
So that in itself is a problem. Um, Also, with Black neurodivergent people, we are butting up against stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to the conversation about behavior versus needs.
Mm,
We are under constant surveillance when we are in K-12
mm,
and other environments. Like,
mm,
to be Black is to be under surveillance and to be monitored.
mm,
And in that surveillance, what is being observed is your
mm,
behavior. So, and even if you're doing all the right things, your behavior could be interpreted as
mm,
non-compliance.
mm,
But the point is that the behavior is getting more attention than the
mm,
needs you have.
mm, mm,
Because if you meet the underlying needs, because behavior is a communicator,
mm, mm,
and but if you meet the underlying needs, then that addresses the behavior. But because people just want
mm,
compliance, or they just want to manage the movement of Black children, then those needs do not get met because you're too focused on obedience and compliance. And this happens at school, but it also happens at home as
yeah,
well, because the parents are used to being under
yeah,
surveillance. And so they just pass that along. And so one of the biggest challenges is seeing Black children as whole
mm,
people
mm, mm,
and people who have human
mm,
needs. If you do not fundamentally accept the personhood of Black children, then these needs will not get met. They will not be, no one will be curious about how to meet those needs. And so rather than talk about, I think you brought this up about the prisons. And rather than talk about um, why someone has a meltdown every day during lunch period,
Mm-hmm.
rather than talk about it, you see a pattern,
Mm-hmm.
right? But rather than talk about that, well, how are we going to clamp down on him
Mm-hmm.
today?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe you can look at the environment in the lunchroom. Maybe it's every time they serve fish sticks, there's a problem
Yeah.
because he's
Yeah.
having something is happening
Mm-hmm.
there. Or maybe it's the noise in the classroom. I mean, in the lunchroom. Or maybe it's you're moving him from place to place too
Mm-hmm.
fast. The transitions are too fast for an autistic
Mm-hmm.
child. So you refuse to look at the environment and consider that there are numerous environmental factors that you could
Mm-hmm.
control. And so one of the big things is dependence on the stereotype. But it's not even that, it is the lack of people's willingness to accept the personhood of
Oh
Black
man.
children and Black
Mm.
people.
Man. I whew, so much fire in what you just shared. Like I it's literally not possible for me to agree more. I mean, I think the fundamental message around accepting and seeing the humanity in anyone, but particularly in Black people, is at the core of why so many of these challenges come up. As I was doing my investigation into, my neurodivergence and what giftedness looked like, during my schooling, just to kind of go back to the schooling part. I had several experiences that I can look at where white children did either the same thing or worse, and they were, praised, or they
Yeah,
were recognized, like, oh, this, we need to give Johnny some support. Me, it was
yeah,
this, you're out of line. Talking about principal's office, or so many different things. And there have been studies. I'm trying to think of what this was, but I just remember reading this study where they had teachers observing, like, whatever, let's say 5 or 6 kids around a table, and they were like basically asking them to point out when somebody's like doing something wrong. And
uh-huh,
without fail, those whose eyes they were so they fixated their eyes most on the little Black children, and noticing their
yeah.
behaviors and calling out their behaviors. And they were like, well, this kid over here was actually the one who was doing something, but you were so focused on uh you know
Yeah, and I've seen
hmm
studies like that. There was one where they were videotaping teachers, and the observation was that if a Black boy were slow to respond, it's like, oh my God, he's
hmm
slow. He's disruptive. And a white boy doing the same thing is, oh, he's
hmm
thoughtful.
hmm hmm
He's taking his time to figure it out. And it's like you can
absolutely.
look at the exact same thing, exact same behavior, and frame it differently. If you do not fundamentally believe in the personhood of the
hmm
child and you are adultifying
yeah.
them, you are assuming you're assigning more
hmm
intent. The thing with neurodivergent Black children, the double
hmm
whammy, is they are often very
hmm
intelligent, very capable. And so then you can look to test scores and you can look to academic performance and say, see, they know
hmm
better.
hmm
They
hmm
absolutely know
hmm
better.
hmm
But the thing about neurodivergent children is what they call uneven
hmm
skills, or asynchronous
hmm
skills, or uneven skills, something like that, where they may be very proficient at something, but not be able to tie their
absolutely.
shoes.
Absolutely.
Very proficient at something and be 11 years old and start to regress in other
hmm
ways to an 8-year old, because they suddenly became afraid
hmm
of something. And so then they started back sucking their thumb or some other behavior that was typical of them when they were 8
yeah.
years old. So and this is what I'm talking about with neurodiversity. We assume that human beings are one
hmm
thing, but we're all a lot of different things. And even within
hmm
ourselves, we're a lot of different things at different
yes,
times.
absolutely.
And if you don't think of it from that neurodiverse lens, then you do not allow room for those types of behaviors and the underlying needs that go along with, or the needs that underlie the
Yeah.
behaviors.
No, again, excuse me. I'm 100% on board with that, and I, like you said, the behaviors are signals of unmet needs, right? There's so much power. One of the things I just generally say in life, and I just kind of came up with this recently, just this phrasing at least, was, how important it is to check in before you check out, right? Because there's so
Mm-hmm.
much, so many things where people were like, oh, this is such and such behavior. This is bad, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, did you check in to see if maybe, they had something going on at home? Did you check in,
Right.
whatever those things are, right?
Right.
And if you say, oh,
Or there's something going on
no,
here at
no, exactly
school.
right. No, exactly. It could be something going on at the school. And I
Yeah.
know that there have depth. I mean, even I'll just say, I've shared this story before on the podcast, but like literally, literally, first grade, the teacher thought exactly what you just said. Sheldon is, disinterested, disrespectful, not capable, blah, 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 whatever, whatever, whatever. Come to find out, my mom comes down to the school and it's like, that doesn't sound like Sheldon. I was bored. I slept
Sure.
through first grade because it was like, what are we doing here? I know all these different things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so instead of saying, immediately thinking, let's actually talk to this child and see what's going on, no, let's demonize this child. And, I know people who tell stories about being put into, separate classrooms, and all these different things. And, the last thing I'll just say really quickly is I know in working in um, different environments where quote unquote delinquent children were, that a lot of the times their behaviors were very much so just based on, like you said, what was happening at the school, what was happening at home, and just an outgrowth of the unmet needs. And once you kind of, you know, address those things, spoke to those things, you actually made a
Right.
lot of inroads and kind of getting them to come along with you, I guess is sort of the way of saying it.
No, they're trying to exist in a carceral
Mm-hmm.
system that is designed to imprison
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a carceral system is going to be a carceral
Mm-hmm.
system
Yeah, no, that's good.
and place their needs very low priority if at
Mm-hmm.
all.
No, that's exactly it. And like I said, we could do 10 podcasts on that because, um, yeah, I mean, there's so much, as we talk about the layers of how, you know, uh, melanated and marginalized communities end up in these, institutions. It's so many different angles that they, can come from to end up there, and how frustrating it is. Like just thinking in my mind about even in grad school, like I'm thinking about in grad school. I have my engineering degree. I'm coming here. I've
Mm-hmm.
got, I'm at this higher place of learning. I'm not 12 years old anymore. And yet,
Right.
the assumptions about my behavior, it might as well have been from, being a 5-year old.
Right. Sure. No, no, it carries
And,
through. And I mean, ironically or
and,
coincidentally, I am starting to focus on how to support grad
mm,
students because I used to be a dean, associate dean of graduate
mm-hmm,
studies. So I'm thinking more about how to support graduate students in that process and asking questions of like the disability
mm-hmm,
services office, of the
mm-hmm,
libraries, of the writing centers, of the tutoring centers to really investigate how they are attempting to address
yeah.
your needs.
Yeah, no, that's really, really important work. Like I said, I know there were, you know, what I was going to say even is like, there are times when I'm like, I'm trying to actually comply or like fit into this box, but you're seeing me as doing the complete opposite. And that now my reaction is of frustration and the thought, the quote that I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I think MLK probably did actually say this, but it was like, he's talking about people asked him about, he asked him about the riots, and it was basically saying that these riots are, basically a reflection of people feeling unheard, right? And if we don't sit around, if we sit around and just think, oh, black people just love destroying their neighborhood versus, wait, who would
Right.
who would go around doing this if not for something,
Right.
else going on. And so, yeah. So, um, this is again a little bit of a shift here, but I know I'm very, very curious about, this experience because I just started to realize one, how much these things are tied together, and two, how few people are aware that they are tied together. So, in some cases, people know that they have ADHD or on the autism spectrum, but many don't realize that they have both. And I know I've seen studies that,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't remember the percentages off the top of my head, but apparently there's a large percentage of folks who do, um, end up having both. And if you've seen any of those studies or have any thoughts about that, I'd be curious as to why do you think that exists, and you know how does one begin to recognize maybe when there's something more.
Re-ask me your
Yeah,
question.
sorry. So yeah, that was a little bit convoluted. So
No, it's okay. I just want to make sure I
yeah.
understand what it.
So basically, what I'm asking is that this is kind of tied to this thought of like the diagnosis and the challenges around diagnosis. Is that a lot of times people will get diagnosed with one thing, whether it be ADHD or ASD, let's say, but they will feel
Mm-hmm.
like there's something more, like the medication or the support system. They're not.
Yeah. Okay.
So one, why do you think that happens where they're only getting diagnosed for one? And then two, how is it that someone um, can recognize when it's not just one, it is both? Is that hopefully that clarifies the question.
Okay. So the first part is why is that
Yeah.
happening? Why are they sometimes they get
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed for one thing and there clearly something else that's happening there that is
Mm-hmm.
unexplained, I
Mm-hmm.
think
Mm-hmm.
is what you're asking me. In a colonized system that makes sense, right? Because it's about a path of least
Mm-hmm.
resistance. It could for that person, but also for a healthcare system that pathologizes
Mm-hmm.
need. And so it is about going back to just a colonized mindset. When you go, you seek a diagnosis, and I am all for diagnosis. And if you need one, you
Mm-hmm.
should get one. But just recognize that there are a lot of people out there who are trying to get to that quick, simple
Mm-hmm.
answer. So they're trying to get you there and move you on, get you in a treatment program. That's not everybody, but that is a lot of people. Um, but going back to the personhood, if they do not see you as a person, they cannot be bothered to listen to what your
Mm-hmm.
needs are and hear the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
that's happening. And so, number one, making sure you're working with people who fundamentally see you as a whole person who's willing to ask questions, because this answers the second part. There has to be genuine curiosity
Mm-hmm.
for there in this situation. And um, it doesn't, like, the expertise matters, and all of that is important, but you need to be genuinely curious about yourself
Mm-hmm.
without
Mm-hmm.
judgment
Mm-hmm.
and work with people who are genuinely curious about you, because it is only through that non-judgmental curiosity that you can allow these things to really come through. And some of the things that you have to be curious about, going back to the decolonizing thing, is you have to be curious about the different systems that have played a role
Mm-hmm.
in your life, how you have been harmed by those systems, but also how you have participated in those systems to do harm to other
Mm-hmm.
people. And what is your role? What is your expected role within those systems? When you can start to deconstruct that and pull that apart, that gives you an opportunity to really sit down and exist with
Mm-hmm.
your needs
Mm-hmm.
without judgment. And when you start to separate that, you can start to say things like, oh my God, like, you mean I don't really have to
Mm-hmm.
do that? Even if they've told me my whole life I had to do that? But what this also means is when you start to deconstruct and decolonize, and this can be in conjunction with the diagnosis, there is a grieving process, because what you will have to come to terms with is you are not the person that said you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, you have to start to
Yeah.
recognize yourself all over
Yeah.
again.
That's you just said, again, several things that were extremely insightful, because as we go through this process of, again, whatever your neurodivergence, entails, as particularly as late identified or late diagnosed folks, one of the things that you have to be aware of is there's going to be this, not just reawakening, right? When we talk about the reawakening, it's like, oh, I'm aware of some things, but there's this also of like, oh, wait, like, what I know, one of the questions I keep hearing from folks is, what part of me is me and what part of me is this system, right?
Right.
And that
Right.
is not a comfortable place to be, particularly,
It's
it's
very
right.
uncomfortable.
Particularly, I love you talking about the judgment, the freedom of judgment, because when you still have that judgment baked in, one of the systems is around ableism, right? So when you're not even aware
Mm-hmm.
of the ableism that you've been subjected to and that you've participated in,
Right.
you coming like, oh, wait a second. Like you said, I don't have to, I'm not this person. I don't have to be this person. I, you know,
I wasn't put here to serve
right,
other people all
exactly.
the time. Is that
Right,
what you like
right,
as a black woman, you have to
exactly.
examine that. Your life is not
No,
about
no,
servitude.
100%. And so, um, it's so, it's so powerful to do that work. It's challenging. You need a lot of grace. You need to give yourself a lot of time to work through it. But it's so powerful to do it, because on the other side, like you said, you have yourself. You have the self that you've been wrestling with, right? Like, that's, for me, what this journey for me
Mm-hmm.
has been so much about, is realizing how much I've been wrestling with the true self. And because of the judgments,
Right.
because of the
Right.
expectations, because of, who I told myself, or was I allowed other people to tell me that I had to be, and in choosing my true self, it's like, it's scary, Sheldon. You don't, there's going to be people who are not going to get it.
Yeah, and you're not going to find the answer in most self-help books because they do not get to the root of the problem, which is your relationship.
Yeah, no, right.
And so if you don't ever address that, if you don't ever examine that, you can do like all the self-help stuff that you want to do, and it just kind of keeps you, I talk about how it keeps you in a cycle of hope, optimism, and
Mm,
self-loathing. Hope, optimism,
mm-hmm,
and self-loathing. Hope,
mm-hmm,
optimism, and
mm-hmm,
self-loathing. Because it doesn't really offer you any answers. It doesn't really offer you any new insights. Not really, not for an
mm-hmm,
extended period of time. And so that's why it doesn't work for you. And so one of the things I think you want to talk about is like, what do I wish the world had like, what capacity do I wish the world would
mm-hmm,
build
mm-hmm,
for us is room to
mm-hmm,
investigate these things, room to rest, room to
mm-hmm,
restore. Um, because what I found, especially like over like the pandemic and people being home, and it's initially when we were never really under a lockdown, but when people sequestered at home for a while, it gave people time to stop and
mm-hmm.
pause and think. And when people had time to do that, the
Yeah,
conversations
yeah.
changed. And so I wish we had more capacity to question, to be curious, to rest, to restore, um, to just breathe and look around and see what's
Mm-hmm,
happening with us, and then see what's happening with other people, and more room for a relationship. Because as it is now, the way things are set up now, it is a challenge to relationship with ourselves and with
yeah.
other people.
No, yeah, you're right. That's definitely one of the questions that I have, is around the capacity. And then even, kind of the next question that I was going to even go into, which is, how do we find the balance between, making neurodivergence a part of our identity, but also like not defining us, right? Like, I think there's something to be said for and I also love what you said earlier. I wanted to make sure that I called that out. Like when you talked about neurodivergence, it wasn't just about the mind, it was about the body, right? And understanding that this is a
Right,
part of
right,
how I'm wired throughout my being, right?
right,
And so I
right,
can't separate that from myself. At the same time,
right.
you know, I am not just, the different manifest behaviors, let me say it that way, right? Like I'm still a full human being, going back to again
Mm-hmm.
what you said earlier. How do we, because I think that's where a lot of the judgment and a lot of the angst around doing the investigation comes in, is because, for example, I'll just, I'll talk about myself. One of the things that I know, and I laugh with people, I've told this story before, but when I got my school records, as I was doing my investigation and identifying, I went back and luckily got my school records. And from second grade, it said Sheldon does not remember names. And this is something that for my entire life has been true. I'm like, I don't remember street names well. I don't remember people's names well. And I just always thought that, you know, I don't know, maybe I wasn't paying attention or whatever it was, but what it made me realize is that, and through other investigation, that this was just a part again of how my wiring worked. And so I bring that up just to say that yes, that is a part of who I am, but it is not all of me, right? Like I'm a bigger, you know, there's a bigger story to tell about myself. But if I get focused on
Right,
that, I can get kind of down like, oh, this is again just a deficiency. But it's like, so
right.
how do we kind of find that balance, I guess, to love our whole selves?
I think you have to decide, you have to realize who's
Mm,
telling the story about you, right? So if we go back to your record, that's a story about you, but it's also a story about
mhm,
the
mhm,
person
mhm,
observing you. And so all of that is
mhm,
value
mhm,
laden. Why the fuck does it matter if Sheldon can't remember streets?
mhm,
Sheldon can
mhm,
Google it now. Why does it's okay if Sheldon doesn't remember a phone number because they're all in
mhm,
his
mhm,
phone now, right? Because they associated that with learning. So that's a
mhm,
story
mhm.
about them as
Absolutely.
well. That's not just a story about them. And when we talk about pulling these things apart, that's what I'm
Absolutely.
talking about.
Absolutely. You made me just think about, you know, even going back to what you talked about with the shoestring, people tying their shoes. Like, I know that there was a time in which, whether or not it was that I couldn't or whether I just didn't like it, that's a whole separate question. But I remember, you know, there was a time where it
Hmm.
was like, Sheldon, you can do all these different things at a high level. What's up with you not tying your shoes, right? And I know there was like a, I don't know if it was on Twitter or somewhere on social media where parents were like super concerned because their child was not meeting these so-called milestones. And
Right.
but it was like, well, does he could like let's just say that your child will figure that part out. Like, could you not just give them, Velcro shoes or whatever, some other kind of accommodation, right? In the meantime, because
Right.
that's not really going to define their success or happiness in life. You know what I mean?
No, it's not. It's not. It's not.
So yeah, I mean, like I said, I love the again touching on that. It's like,
Again,
mm-hmm,
that's a story
mm-hmm,
about them and their understanding and their skill
mm-hmm,
level
mm-hmm,
and their knowledge level.
absolutely, absolutely. Um, so I do want to ask this one question at before we kind of round out. You've talked a little bit about it, but for the parents who are listening, um, can you tell us maybe just a little bit about how you describe your experience parenting a neurodivergent child? Mm,
It's very challenging. Very challenging. I think you have
mm,
to be a student. I think you have to spend more
mm-hmm,
time observing and just taking note of and
mm-hmm,
less time
mm-hmm,
reacting. So everything does not require an
mm-hmm,
immediate
mm-hmm,
reaction. Most things are going to be okay, even if you don't react in that moment. And my philosophy is connection even more
mm-hmm,
than discipline. Because at the end of the day, what my child is going to know is that there's a safety net. And as long as I'm alive, my husband is alive, my relatives are alive, that there's a safety net, there's a
mm-hmm,
safe place where he can land. That is more important than
Mm-hmm.
correcting
Mm-hmm.
him on everything. And here's the kicker, the way his neurodivergence works, you can't correct everything in the present. You have to let
Mm-hmm.
it settle and come back to him later because he
Mm,
cannot hear you. And that's the thing. So that's how you get into power struggles. Because if the way their neurodivergence works, like if they have what they call the persistent drive for autonomy, where in that wired neural system and kind of what people
mm-hmm.
call rigid thinking, when they're in the heat of the moment and you're trying to impose your will and trying to tell them better and get them to do this and do,
Yeah.
that's a power struggle. And when you're in a power struggle with them, you've already lost if you're in the
Yeah.
power struggle with them. So cut yourself some slack. Be curious. Be a student of what is happening to your child. You are not going to lose anything by taking time to observe what they need and really plugging into what they
Yeah.
need and not the
I
behavior.
think that's beautiful, and like y- you said a whole lot without saying many things, if that makes any sense. But I love that, the connection over the discipline, because I think, again, the way that the system is set up, it wants us to think that parenting is primarily about the discipline, right? And it is.
It's carceral. Because it's a carceral
Absolutely,
system.
absolutely. And so, um, yeah, and understanding that, again, in this moment, I'm fighting a losing battle if I try to like get the lesson absolutely, like, right now. It's not that that's
Right,
not going to work.
right.
And if ultimately,
This is not the place where you need to be the teacher or the preacher. This is not the
no,
place to do it.
yeah, um, yeah, no, that's like I said, a beautiful, beautiful thing. So, we talked a little bit about what we think the world should build capacity for. I don't know if you had, maybe one or two other things you wanted to say about that, but otherwise, um, I did want to ask a related but slightly different question, about, maybe what are like two things, that you think are keys to neurodivergent healing and thriving that you might want to share with folks.
A couple of things. Number one, have
Mm-hmm.
grace for yourself because you were told that you were one person and you were one thing, and you're so many
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
things. And so, have as part of having grace, just be curious about yourself. Just how do you tick? What makes you do things? Why? And allow you, if you can, allow yourself to do that without judgment. And then number two, I want to go back to
Mm-hmm.
something that you talked about earlier, is having an embodied experience. Everything about this system is about separating from
Mm-hmm.
you, your mind, and your body. So know that you are a sensory
Mm-hmm.
organism. And so, how do you smell, taste,
Mm-hmm.
touch, feel the world? How do what is your space in the world? Uh, you know, how do you take up space relative to what's happening around you
Mm-hmm.
in your environment? And so allow yourself to have that embodied experience, to feel the feelings, to interpret the world
Mm-hmm.
as you interpret it without judgment. You can judge it later, but in that moment, if you can, just allow yourself to have those experiences because you are having to
Mm-hmm.
reimagine who
Mm-hmm.
you are. And that is a
Yeah.
really tall order.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, I love that. And, I just want to touch again on the sensory part, because I think a lot of people, there's, uh, what just popped in my mind, of course, my mind's trying to tell me this. It reminds me of the joke that everybody talks about, that about people driving. And it's like, do you turn the music down while you're driving to, you know, park better, or find your way, right? And
Right.
generally speaking, that just seems like a joke or whatever, just kind of like a strange quirk. But when you think about it, when you understand the sensory inputs that are going on, like, you're processing all of this information, taking one of those and
Right. That's right.
right?
It's a
Right?
lot of
Like you're turning
information.
one of those. It literally works. It's not just like a weird thing. Um, and understanding that wait, so if this is happening just when I'm driving and trying to park, where else is this happening? How else are these sensory, you know, uh, inputs impacting just my ability to move through the world? And if there were a way to quote unquote turn the dial down on one of those things, how might I be able to show up, better, to love myself more, to see myself more,
Hmm.
or whatever, right? Like again, I'm 100%, you know, agree with that. And I think it's really important to say. Um, is there anything else that you wanted to say about, again, we talked a little bit more a little earlier about things that we wish the world created more capacity for. Did you want to add anything else to that? um
Um, I think underneath it all is,
mhm,
do you see me as a person? Because if you see me as a person, if you see me as a whole person deserving of personhood,
mhm,
deserving of humanity, then you're
mhm,
going to
mhm,
create space for me. You're going to devote resources to increasing the capacity
mhm,
for my safety. You're going to do those things if you fundamentally see me as a human being. And so I encourage people, like we've talked about a lot of challenges, but it is critical that you see
mhm,
your own humanity. And for parents, it is critical that you see your
mhm,
child
mhm,
as a whole person. It doesn't matter if they're 4 or 5 years old, but a person who is 4 or 5 years old, who has lots of insights about about their embodied experience, because they haven't been talked out of their
mhm,
embodied
mhm,
experience
mhm,
yet.
mhm.
So see your own personhood, see your child's personhood in the humanity and
Yeah,
the personhood of others.
yeah. I love that. And this is seemingly random, but it's something I want to make sure that I explicitly say, is that one of the things I've appreciated about having you join me is, speaking to this as a Black woman. I know that there are, again, it's doing this work. There are so many things that there's like levels of, um, I'll just say oppression. I'll just call it oppression, right? That people think,
Hmm.
oh, that's the last level. And it's like, well, no, like, with the ways in which all these things intersect, Black women, their voice is often misconstrued or silenced. And for me, just speaking about this in general is important, but making sure that, um, like I said, your voice and the voices of other, Black women are heard, so that we know that there's not a speculation
Hmm.
about, your perspective and how you're viewing things. Like it's so important.
Right.
So I'm just really grateful, um, that you were able to come through and share your voice. And like I said, I just wanted to make sure that I called that
Happy to
out.
be here.
Yeah. So having said that, can you want to tell us about any, upcoming existing projects or upcoming projects, or, how folks can find you, book you, all that fun stuff?
So I am always happy to talk with people about speaking
Mm-hmm.
engagements, webinars. The quickest way to get me is Dr. Kimberly Douglass, 2ss.com. My website is going through some changes because I'm
Mm-hmm.
changing my focus on a few things. But if you want to talk about anything that I mentioned here, I can provide support in all the areas that I mentioned. Or you can email me at Douglas, Douglass, at
Mm-hmm.
drkimberlydouglass.com. Either one of those would be good. If you send me an email, just mention the podcast
Mm-hmm.
just to give me a frame of reference. But I'm happy to talk with you. I started out doing parent coaching, and I have friends who do that. But if there's something regarding parent stuff you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk
Mm-hmm.
with you about that as well. But just encourage people to just be curious about yourself and just know that the decolonizing process is not eat, pray, love. It's not self-help. That's not what this is. It is fundamentally discovering
Yeah,
who you are as a
no,
person.
that's a beautiful way to wrap things up. And I will put all that stuff, ways to contact you, into the show notes. But I again, I love this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas, for coming through. Yes, and
I'm grateful
hopefully,
to be here.
in the future we'll circle back. But thank you again. Yeah, this has been really powerful. All right, thanks. Thank you for joining me for another episode of I Must Be Bugged. I hope you've learned something, became curious, and most importantly, felt affirmed by what you heard. Remember, this podcast is all about sharing compassionate narratives about who we are and how we contribute to the beautiful and necessary diversity of humanity. This is our place to unmask and just be. Don't forget to connect with me on IG at I Must Be BUGN, where I'm eager to see you share your thoughts, your experiences, and your stories. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. Leave a review and subscribe. It helps others who are eager for community find our people. So thank you again for being a part of the I Must Be Buggin' community. I can't wait for the next episode. Until then, stay up and enjoy who you were meant to be. And remember, you're not bugging, you're brilliant.